Hi everyone, Nubkeks here, and in today's video we're going to be looking at which specs and classes are doing the best, which are the most popular, especially in Mythic plus dungeons in the Shadowlands pre-patch. We'll also take a quick look at Mythic N'Zoth now, a few weeks into this pre-patch, and see how the spec representation is looking. This is obviously going to be based off of a Wowhead article that was looking specifically at the healers, and I'll show you that article and link it in the description if you want to check out the original article. But we're going to look at every role. We're going to look at tanks and damage dealers as well, of course. I obviously did, a look at the best performing DPS specs, really, for the raids. A couple of weeks ago, and people went nuts over that video. The Asmongold reacted to that video. Everything happened. I have to reiterate the exact same thing I said at the start of that video. I'm going to say at the start of this video, which is the most important thing. Is this representative of Shadowlands? No, not quite at all, because while we do have the Shadowlands class changes, not all classes even have all of their abilities. For example, priests, they don't have power infusion, which is a big, massive 2-minute cooldown. They just simply don't have that until they get higher levels, which we'll get to in Shadowlands. And even more importantly, classes and specs still have Azerite gear, they have their essences on their Heart of Azeroth. That stuff is not going to exist in Shadowlands. We're going to have Covenant abilities, conduits, Shadowlands legendaries, and there's obviously going to be even more class tuning happening between now and then, so stuff could potentially change an awful lot. It could potentially change an awful lot. So this was the original graph that Wowhead had, showing you the breakdown of different specs, and I'm sure you guys have been looking at this in the background. This is the initial Wowhead article, which is very, very cool. Shadowlands Healer Mythic Plus popularity for pre-patch on benched.me. We're going to go into benched.me here, and let's actually zoom it in. And let's take a detailed look at spec performance. And as you can see, this chart is already somewhat updated from what we saw before. So, I mean, one clear example is whereas before, at the time that they took this picture, Resto Druid was the only spec that had done a plus 32 as a healer. When we come into this slightly more updated version, I don't think it's even fully up to date. We can see that, Resto Druid has done half of the level 32 keys, but Holy Paladin and Resto Shaman even are starting to get represented there as well. You can actually go into Raider.io, by the way, and you can look at the top runs if you want to see. Like, there's been 134 done, and you can see the specs and the classes that are going to that. As you can see, it's a fairly small and elite group of players that are going to be doing these 32s. And yeah, I think Growl has a really, really good YouTube channel, by the way, if you want to check that out and get some insight into, like, literally the top of Mythic plus healing and gameplay. So definitely check him out if you're curious. But yeah, as we look at the pre-patch here, let's look at the healers first. How are the healers doing? And it's certainly quite interesting, isn't it? So you can definitely see some trends. So we see that the Resto Druid starts off very popular, actually, holding 27% of the entire player base of healers at +2, just at the very intro level. So, there's 6 specs here, and Resto Druid is representing slightly over 1 in 4 of them. And that popularity just basically steadily increases up to ultimately 50% at the very top end. Interestingly enough, is the Resto Shaman starting off at 19%, ending off at, 17%, actually at 32. So Resto Shaman actually now performing very well in Mythic Plus for a spec that was typically considered very bad. So they're having very consistent representation. If we look at the Holy Priest, you can see that they start off relatively unpopular, and it sort of slowly dies off, and they die off around about key level 27 at 1%. In fact, they actually go into it slightly. There's like 1 key down at level 28, it looks like, 1 or 2 by a Holy Priest. Discipline Priest, actually quite popular. Again, they're maintaining a fairly steady 17% popularity. It slowly starts to drop off around key 20, 30 or so. So those very, very high key levels, 30, 31, 32, they definitely drop off quickly. All Mistweaver monks, again, quite unpopular. They actually get a little bit more popular around here, around the 17, 18, 19. They go up a little bit, and then they sort of slowly die off up to 30. And then the Holy Paladin actually starts off very unpopular and gets more popular as keys go higher. This is kind of interesting. Of course, Holy Paladin is somewhat the most changed healing spec coming into Shadowlands. Obviously, they were one of the most, in fact, here's a great graph. This was in 8.3, and you can see that they were extremely dominant healers in 8.3, right? Extremely, even challenging the Resto Druids. So quite possibly, a lot of these players are used to doing dungeons as Holy Paladin. They're well geared up. Their groups are kind of built around those class utility things. Possibly that is some of it, but it's certainly interesting how their popularity has fallen at the lower key levels. And it has fallen at the top key levels, but they are still there and fairly well represented. But yeah, I mean, here's the thing, guys. If you're, what's the highest key you have done? Why is the highest key you have done? Is it a 28? Because up to 28, at least all the healers are having representation. Obviously, Mistweaver and Holy Priest barely hanging in there, but at least they are there. So that's what the healers are looking like. Let's actually jump in now. Let's look at the tanks, right? Let's have a little look at the tanks. How are the tanks doing? And here we go. Quite an interesting graph. So Protection Warrior starting off relatively unpopular, and then as keys go higher, around about the 20-22 mark, they start to get an awful lot more popular. Okay, we get to the key level 32 and they just magically disappear entirely because a warrior hasn't done a 32 key. Again, there are so few level 32 keys actually done. But still, it gives you a rough idea, doesn't it, that they are getting more popular at the higher levels. In comparison, the Protection Paladin is starting incredibly popular, massively more popular than every other tank, almost twice as popular as nearly everything. Blood DK, 18% is giving them a little bit of a run here at +2, but they're still massively ahead. And then that popularity, again, around the +20 level, starts to decline. Though they are still there, of course, but they start to decline in favor of the Warrior and in favor of the Brewmaster, which again starts very unpopular, but just grows and grows and grows in popularity. The Vengeance Demon Hunter, indeed, sort of grows in popularity, falls off a little bit, but sort of stays consistent, and is actually the only one up there with Brewmaster, having done the very top level of key right now. Guardian Druid, actually, very the least represented tank across the board, definitely the least popular tank, but they're sort of staying strong here, getting representation again nearly up to the highest levels. Blood DK starting as the second most popular, +2. Very steady decline here, very steady decline, dropping off. No Blood DKs yet in the +30 key range, so they have obviously fallen off. So I think it's definitely an interesting chart. The more consistent damage mitigation starts to matter, I think, quite a bit more. Obviously, Paladins can't maintain that full damage mitigation. Blood DKs, they're certainly risky, being based off of taking damage and healing it back up. I assume that's a good chunk of why that they're falling off at these higher key levels, where obviously the Brewmaster Monk, they always have their shuffle, they're always mitigating damage, and that's very, very valuable. Really nice to see Vengeance. I think Vengeance does an awful lot of damage right now, which is probably a big part of why, in AoE, which is probably a big part of why that they are doing well. And I imagine that I don't see any particular reason why the Warrior would drop off here. Perhaps they just don't have quite enough cooldowns, quite enough damage, or perhaps they just simply haven't gotten around to doing it. Again, there's such a small group here. It's hard to say. But yeah, that is how the tanks are looking. Let's switch over to the Melee DPS, and this is quite a fun chart. The thing I like most about this chart is that you have the old Outlaw Rogue starting off the little 7% here. Starting off with a little 7% at the beginning, and then he just fucking squeezes in, and he just stretches out the legs. He just man spreads and takes over the entire chart here at the end, or almost so, because of course the Unholy Death Knight is in there as well, doing incredibly well at those higher end keys here in the pre-patch. So I mean, you can certainly see some this is the most notable thing, certainly the most noticeable thing. But yeah, I mean, once again, you can see the Warriors, obviously Arms is dropping off a lot faster. Fury is still there, and then starts petering off into that 20 key range. The Enhancement Shaman, actually, lots of people giving it a spin, trying it out. There's as many Enhancement Shamans as there are Arms Warriors, which is quite incredible, in my opinion. That's quite staggering. Again, they are sort of in there, and they're sort of falling off. I mean, like up in there, they're 3% of the key levels 29. That's not too bad for Enhancement. They're sort of staying in there a little bit. They're comparable to a Fury Warrior, which is yeah. I mean, obviously Fury Warrior not doing great in the pre-patch, but I mean, it's still something, right? It's still something. The Ret Paladin, again, starting moderately popular, and then sort of slowly fading off by key 30. Havoc Demon Hunter, obviously notoriously doing very badly in the pre-patch. They just don't have the damage numbers. They're obviously a very popular spec, very much so, but once it starts going, again, level 25, they take a rapid decline, and by key 29, they're only barely hanging in there. They just go from being quite a popular class, one of the most popular specs, to almost entirely disappearing very, very quickly when it gets to those much more serious key pushing levels. Windwalker Monk is fairly well represented going through there, bringing that monk utility, which is very valuable in Mythic Plus. You know, if you're not running with the Brewmaster tank in particular, bringing monk utility can be fantastic and really a good addition to the group. That's where Windwalker does tend to shine. And yeah, Frost DK really dropping off very quickly. Frost DK notoriously undertuned right now as well, whereas Unholy is really doing extremely well. And in particular, I guess just their AoE damage, their damage output just insane. And it's really helping them stay up there with the Outlaw Rogues at the absolute top end here in the pre-patch. Feral Druid, of course, is still there and doing not too bad. In fact, there's a little Survival Hunter. It's kind of hard to see them, but Survival Hunter is in there. They're kind of dropping off. Feral Druid actually representing reasonably well. Like, they are still in there. Uncapped AoE with Primal Wrath, I suppose, is having a fairly good good contribution. But there you go. That is that's how the Melee DPS are looking. When we go to the Ranged DPS then, and we look at Ranged DPS, I'd say this is a relatively more stable chart, actually. Things aren't too insane. We have the mages. Obviously, Frost is really dominating. You know, even at +2 key level, Frost is 18% compared to Fire down to only 3%, and Arcane at only 5%. Fire and Arcane just very slowly petering off, and Frost really staying quite stable around 20%-ish, dropping off a little bit. But yeah, Frost doing quite well. Obviously, in the Hunters, we have Marksmanship is seeing a little bit of action, not too much. I expect them to do a bit better, probably in Shadowlands. They were doing very well in Shadowlands. The legendary changes might change that. Whereas BM, again, starting popular-ish, but not too crazy, really starts to shine very much so at these higher levels. BM really doing well at those high levels of the keystones. Shadow Priest, relatively popular the whole way through, falls off a bit at the higher levels. Balanced Druid, relatively unpopular actually, but sort of maintaining a steady level. Again, starting to drop off at around 25 in the key levels. And Ellie Shaman, very unpopular. They definitely struggle with you know, bigger AoE. It's not really their strength. They're really petering off. One of the big new things, though, is that, well, look at this. Affliction Warlock coming in hot here in Shadowlands. Really coming in hot and doing super well here in the pre-patch for Shadowlands, I should say. The pre-patch. Clarify that. But yeah, Destruction Warlock are there for a bit. They're falling off quite quick. Demonology really not seeing any love whatsoever. They're disappearing very quickly. I mean, there's a few of them in there maybe hidden away. I can't even see if they are. But yeah, Affliction is doing great. Fairly solid, you know, consistently lowish representation, but sort of increasing in popularity. And yeah, they're actually in there at the 32. So there you go. That's how all those specs are looking in terms of Mythic Plus. In terms of Mythic Plus, I certainly think that this graph is really interesting to see. Bearing in mind, like +15 is around about your weekly key level, right? That's sort of the maximum cap for your weekly chest, that reward. So that's what I think a lot of players are going for. And then it's, you know, the 16 and higher, that's when you're getting players that are, you know, you're not playing for the reward per se, but you're playing more for the challenge, for the experience, for the competition. So that's something that's always very important to bear in mind, guys, is that when we look at these, you know, these +15 key levels, you can see that every single spec in the game basically has, you know, okay, Survival Hunter is tiny in there. That's fair enough though, but you know, nearly every single spec here at +15 has some representation. They can go in there. You can absolutely do your weekly content perfectly fine and succeed and do very well at it at the +15. It's really, you know, even here at the end of BFA, it's really at, you know, the 20+ that things start to really change, which is quite a step beyond that weekly level. So do bear that in mind, you know, when you're considering Shadowlands and when we start to see how the graphs look for Shadowlands. Now, what I wanted to look at again very sort of quickly was, well, let's also look at how those specs are doing or which specs are being brought even to Mythic N'Zoth, right? Because you can see some fairly stark things here. I'm actually slightly in the way. Let me make myself slightly smaller. So if we, okay, you know what? Let me actually just remove myself entirely. There we go. Goodbye. Goodbye. I'm fading away. Yeah, Mythic N'Zoth. This is the healers. Again, this is, you know, the entirety of the pre-patch. So it starts off a little bit crazy, and then things have sort of settled down. This is the ranking by the healing that they're doing. But if we look here and you can sort by parses, and this is going to be a very useful thing to do to see how popular specs are. Again, this is across just every single person that has done a logged kill of Mythic N'Zoth, which are basically all kills of Mythic N'Zoth. You can see for the people that have actually done it, Paladins actually are the most popular healer spec on Mythic N'Zoth still, with elite representation right there. I didn't even plan that. I only noticed that now. Resto Shaman are coming in second most popular with 1,000 represented kills. And then we have the Disc Priest at about 800, the Resto Druid about 700, 600 for the Holy Priest, and 400 for Mistweaver, the least popular spec right now. Now, interestingly, if you sort it by the healing per second, you can see quite a big difference. So funny enough, actually, by average healing per second, which is represented by this graph, it is interesting that Holy Paladin, the most represented healer, actually has, by quite a large amount, the worst healing per second. Of course, you know, the two don't necessarily correlate to each other. It's not overly important in the sense that healing per second is not at all the most important thing. You also have to consider the damage that the specs are bringing. Holy Paladin, of course, brings Aura Mastery, which is this incredibly powerful damage reduction cooldown, which can get you through those dangerous moments like Evoke Anguish. They also have, you know, very much bursty healing in their cooldowns. You know, you pop wings and you're instantly bursting. That can be extremely valuable compared to, well, let's say a Holy Priest can do extremely good healing per second, but something like Divine Hymn requires them to stand still to channel, same like as Tranquility for Resto Druid, right? So that is a value that Holy Paladin brings that isn't going to be represented in the healing per second chart. But yeah, certainly if we even go by max healing per second, so people that are really trying to get as much healing as is humanly possible out of their spec on this fight, you can see that Discipline Priest can do the most healing out of any spec on Mythic N'Zoth. Holy Priest just behind Disc. And then, you know, really, I mean, Holy Resto, the two Restos are really all very close to each other. And then we've got Holy Paladin and Mistweaver a little bit lower, So that, I think, is certainly an interesting graph to look at. We look at the tank representation over the last 2 months. Again, it starts off a little bit wacky, but we come in here and we search, filter it by parses. We can see that Brewmaster Monks are still the most popular, about 1,000 of those in for kills. Death Knights, Blood Death Knights, very popular as well, with about 600. Protection Paladins in third place of popularity with about 400. Demon Hunters, Vengeance, about 250. Prot Warriors and Druids then lingering and tailing a bit behind. Certainly, I think these numbers are interesting because, you know, this is Mythic N'Zoth. These are players that are looking to get cutting edge, and they are testing out their specs and seeing how their specs perform in preparation for Shadowlands. So I think that is something that's really worth considering, that the specs that have the most parses, arguably some of it for sure, a big part of it even could be that these are simply the characters that they have geared, right? These are the ones they have geared enough to actually kill the N'Zoth boss. But another part of it could very much be they want to actually test it out. So that is something that's very interesting. When we look then at the DPS, finally, if we search by parses, you can see there can be some quite staggering differences here. So for example, whereas the Beast Mastery variant of the Hunters here in the pre-patch have over 3,000 kills on Mythic N'Zoth, poor old Survival Hunters have a mere 20. Now that is a staggering number, and this can really let you appreciate the relative balance for tanks and healers, where basically all of those specs have somewhat decent representation. Certainly nothing along the lines of 19 kills versus 3,000, that's for sure. But yeah, you can see that they are by far the most popular. Frost Mage is very popular, but even still 700 below. That's a massive jump below. Warlocks and Affliction still down there. Havoc Demon Hunters, despite being absolutely terrible, in fact, on the overall DPS, they are last, guys. They are last. They're still the fourth most popular spec. Again, I think this is because Havoc Demon Hunter is an incredibly popular spec, obviously an 8.3, and it's simply the stuff that people have geared, and obviously you want to have at least one for that Chaos brand. On Mythic N'Zoth, bringing two is even, you know, has some value because you can send one to each Psychus phase, etc. Shadow Priests are in there, Balanced Druids, and then a relatively reasonable mix. Certainly, I would say things start falling off pretty hard here in this sort of bottom bit here with Fire Mages, you know, gone from the gods. All the Fire Mages are like, ooh, let's try out Frost now, basically. Arcane actually more popular than Fire right now. Windwalker Monks, Assassination Rogues, Marksmanship Hunters, Enhancement Shaman, Feral Druids, Frost Death Knights, Survival Hunters, and Demonology Warlocks, all sort of falling off. I mean, if we knock it back, let's knock it back to Carapace. Let's see how things are on Carapace, a less serious boss. In terms of that representation, I guess it's even more stark. We now have 3,500 for Beast Mastery Hunters. Survival Hunters now the least popular with 21. But yeah, I think it pretty much still looks very similar, I would say, actually, even on Carapace, if we knock it to something that's like in the middle of the raid, Shadhar, we can see in terms of representation, again, it's still looking quite similar across the board, I would say. not seeing any massive changes there. I mean, Arcane actually jumped up a good bit for that single target fight. They're not doing too badly. But there you go, guys. I thought that would just be kind of, a little bit interesting. See how the different specs are doing. In particular, I wanted to focus more so on Mythic Plus in this one, just as that really interesting visual. I just love this visual. This is my favorite one. Just the Outlaw Rogue pushing their way through. And again, inspired. Shout out to Wowhead that actually did this and started to break things down. You can dive into this as well, really good. You can see comments from like the guide writers for a few of the different healing specs on why their specs are doing well. Obviously checked out benched.me for more in-depth info, and they do lots of other stuff as well. You can check it out, like more advanced stuff and so on as you wish. But yeah, guys, that's a look there at how the specs are doing in terms of representation. I think it's certainly kind of interesting to know what people are playing. And then we can, we don't know why they're playing it, but we can certainly speculate about why. But knowing what is interesting. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.